Welcome to the show.
Welcome back to From Kitchen to C-Suite. Today we're unpacking COVID-19's credit card, ending the digital guilt trip, a deep dive into how pandemic-era tech decisions, lingering financial debt, and digital customer friction are still weighing on hospitality balance sheets, and how top operators are finally paying off that tab.
It's a huge topic, and I'm really glad we're getting into it today.
Same here, and for you listening, today's mission is to really pull back the curtain on how emergency measures permanently rewired our retail behavior.
Yeah, we've got a massive stack of sources to go through today.
Oh, absolutely. We're looking at heavy macroeconomic data from the Federal Reserve, this groundbreaking 2025 consumer survey from Talker Research, and some really deep consumer psychology reports published in Science Direct.
Which are fascinating, by the way.
They really are. We're going to deconstruct the UI dark patterns of payment software, the hidden economic incentives of the tech platforms, and, the massive consumer backlash underway right now.
It's a perfect storm.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to imagine doing the physical labor of picking your own strawberries in a sweltering field. You are carrying a heavy basket, your hands are stained red, you walk up to an outdoor register to pay for the literal fruits of your own labor.
And the screen flips around.
Exactly. The digital screen spins around, demanding a 35% tip.
Which is just wild.
Right. I want you to think of digital tip screens like a house guest who arrived during a severe emergency, say a blizzard or a hurricane.
Okay, I like this analogy.
At first, you were thrilled to help. You gave them the spare room. You fed them. During the pandemic, we offered hazard pay because things were genuinely dire.
Right, it was a lifeline.
But now, years later, the storm has completely passed. And not only is this house guest still on your couch, but they've completely redecorated your living room, they've changed the locks, and they are aggressively demanding 30% of your groceries every single time you open the fridge.
Yeah, it is an incredibly apt analogy. What's fascinating here is how an act of genuine localized community support has kind of calcified into a rigid structural fixture of modern commerce.
It really did just get stuck there.
It did. When we look back at the origins of this in 2020, consumers were giving 20 to 25% purely to keep the lights on at their local cafes,
Right, and to support frontline workers taking on unknown biological risks.
Exactly. But what the data shows us now is that this lifeline was captured by the underlying technology. It got hard-coded into the payment architecture.
So it morphed into a permanent tax.
Yeah, an automated expected tax on almost every physical transaction.
It was an emergency measure that mutated.
Right.
I mean, we tipped because the person handing us our takeout was wearing a mask during a health crisis.
Right.
But for us to really understand how we got to this point in 2025, where everyone is utterly exhausted by tipping, we can't just blame the barista or the business owner.
Not at all.
We have to look at the structural architectural shift that happened overnight in 2020.
Exactly. And we have to view this through the lens of operational tech debt. Prior to 2020, tipping in the United States had relatively strict, culturally agreed-upon boundaries.
Yeah, like full-service dining, hair salons, valets, delivery.
Right. Environments where a dedicated worker was directly assisting you over a sustained period of time.
Sure.
If you went into a quick service environment, like a bakery or a counter service taco stand, you might see an acrylic tip jar next to the register.
Oh man, the classic tip jar.
Yeah. And interacting with that jar was a passive choice. You could drop your loose change in there, or you could completely ignore it, and there was zero engineered social friction.
None whatsoever.
But when the health protocols descended in early 2020, they fundamentally altered the physical nature of a transaction. Paper currency was instantly stigmatized.
Right. I remember businesses literally putting signs up saying, "We do not accept cash."
It was viewed as dirty, potentially a fomite for the virus.
So there was a massive scramble. If you were a hospitality operator, you couldn't rely on your legacy on-premise cash registers anymore.
No, you had to rapidly migrate your entire front of house to cloud-based, touchless point-of-sale stacks.
And that migration wasn't just a simple hardware upgrade. When the industry universally adopted cloud-based POS stacks, companies like Square, Toast, Clover, we basically allowed Silicon Valley UI and UX designers to dictate the parameters of our front-of-house customer interactions.
That's the key right there. We moved from an analog tip jar, which relies on passive emission, to a mandatory digital gate.
You're forced into an active commission.
Exactly. The software physically will not allow the transaction to close until the customer makes a declarative choice about a gratuity.
Let me stop you there, because this is where the psychology really gets hijacked. It's not just that there's a screen, it's what is on the screen.
Right.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. Why did the traditional 15% benchmark just vanish into thin air?
It really did just disappear.
For decades, 15% was the universally accepted standard for standard service. 20 was for exceptional service. Now you go to a counter, and the baseline options are 18, 20, 22, or even 25%.
Yeah.
How did a software update completely rewrite an ingrained cultural math problem?
Well, it comes down to a highly effective behavioral economics principle called anchoring bias.
Anchoring bias. Okay, explain that.
In cognitive psychology, anchoring refers to our brain's tendency to rely heavily on the first piece of information offered when making a decision. That first number becomes the anchor.
Ah, I see.
So when software developers configured these POS systems, they set the default quick select buttons to start at 18 or 20%.
Wow.
By completely eliminating the 10 or 15% options from the primary visual field and positioning 20% as the middle, safe choice, they force the consumer's brain to instantly recalibrate.
So the UI design is effectively creating a new reality. If 20% is presented as the middle option, then historically normal numbers like 15% suddenly feel mathematically inadequate.
Even if the service hasn't changed at all.
That's crazy.
It's more than inadequate, honestly. They feel socially punitive. In this new context created by the screen, hitting 15% feels like you are actively penalizing the worker.
Oh, totally.
And hitting 0% feels downright hostile. This is compounded by the physical reality of the hardware. Researchers call it enforced social pressure.
Because you're not filling out a paper receipt at a quiet table where you could just walk away.
Right. A swiveling tablet forces this active choice directly within the line of sight of the employee.
It's a literal standoff.
Yeah.
The hardware is designed to swivel. That physical motion is a behavioral trigger.
It absolutely is. And, to opt out of those inflated default numbers, the UI requires you to perform a secondary action.
Right, you have to hunt for a subtle, often pale gray custom amount button.
Or a microscopic no-tip button. And you have to do this while the employee is standing 2 feet away, watching your finger hover over the screen.
The worst feeling.
It introduces intentional, engineered friction. The path of least resistance is simply to tap the 20% button to make the awkwardness end.
It is the absolute definition of an uncomfortable standoff. And there's a perfect, almost painful example of this in our sources.
The Manhattan coffee shop story.
Yes. They profile a 34-year-old software engineer in Manhattan named Marcus Vance. Marcus goes into a crowded, high-volume coffee shop on a humid Tuesday morning. He orders a single iced Americano.
Okay.
The total comes to $5.25. The employee rings him up, spins the tablet around, and the options presented are 22%, 25%, and 30%.
For a coffee.
For a coffee. Marcus is standing there. There is a massive line of impatient New Yorkers behind him. The barista is staring at him expectantly. So what does he do? He taps the 22% button.
Of course he does.
He adds $1.16 to his order. But here is the kicker, and this is why people are losing their minds over this. He poured the coffee himself. It was from a self-serve draft tap on the side counter.
Wow. That is the crux of the modern tipping paradox right there. He provided his own service, yet felt compelled to tip.
Exactly. He tipped over 20% to spend roughly 4 seconds in front of a machine.
Yeah.
When interviewed later, he explicitly stated it wasn't out of generosity. He viewed it as a transaction fee paid to escape social embarrassment.
He paid $1.16 just to get out of the gaze of the barista and the judgment of the crowd. That flash of micro-shame is incredibly potent, and frankly, it is exactly what the entire digital tipping architecture relies upon. You're effectively paying a premium to relieve your own engineered psychological discomfort.
There was another amazing conversation about this exact absurdity on the Valuetainment podcast that we looked at.
Oh, the muffin and banana story.
Yes. The host was describing a trip to a mainstream coffee chain, just wanting a muffin and a banana. He describes the employee literally turning around, grabbing the muffin in a bag, grabbing the banana, absolutely no preparation, no warming it up, and tossing it on the counter.
Like a fish vendor throwing a catch at a market.
Exactly like that. And then the employee spins the screen around. with the options 25, 28, and 30%.
Unbelievable.
And they just stand there.
Yeah.
And the host is thinking, you didn't do anything. If you had warmed it up, if you had asked how my day was, maybe. But asking for 30% for simply handing a piece of unwashed fruit across a counter.
It's wild.
It puts the consumer in this incredibly awkward situation. Very much like when you're checking out the grocery store and the cashier loudly asks, would you like to round up to donate to the children's hospital? And everyone in line stops to see if you hate children.
Right. It is the weaponization of public perception. You are leveraging the innate human desire to conform to social norms, but you are artificially inflating what that norm is through software.
But wait, if consumers are fuming and workers are stressed, the only reason these screens are proliferating is if someone in the middle is benefiting from this friction.
Oh, they definitely are.
Who is actually collecting on this? Because if you look at the macro environment, businesses know customers hate this. So why are they doing it? We need to follow the money behind the screen because the trail doesn't just end in the barista's paycheck.
That is the most critical question an operator can ask. Because the explosion of digital tipping did not happen by accident. It was a highly lucrative feature of the software.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Let's break down what industry analysts call the Fintech trick.
The Fintech trick.
Right. The payment networks, the massive tech platforms that provide this hardware and software, operate on a revenue model fundamentally tied to processing fees. They charge the merchant a fee, typically ranging from 2.5% to 3.5% plus a few cents on every single transaction.
Right, which is standard merchant processing. Every business leader listening knows about swipe fees.
Yes, but here is the critical, often overlooked detail in the architecture. That percentage fee is calculated on the gross payment volume, or GPV.
The total settled amount.
Exactly. That means the fee is assessed on the price of the item, plus the local tax, plus the tip.
Wait, let me pause you right there because this is a massive blind spot for a lot of operators.
It is.
Are you saying the restaurants are paying processing fees on the gratuity that legally has to pass entirely through to the employee?
Precisely. If a software vendor can design a user interface that nudges a customer's tip from an analog average of, say, 8% up to a digital default of 22%, that platform just artificially increased the total ticket size.
Oh my God.
They increased their gross payment volume and thereby increased their transaction fee without adding a single cent of overhead or providing any additional value to the merchant. Higher default tips represent free, frictionless corporate revenue for the financial technology platforms.
So the software isn't just a neutral tool facilitating a payment. It is aggressively soliciting higher tips because the software company gets a direct cut of the customer's guilt.
Basically, yes.
That is wild.
It is a brilliant, albeit controversial, alignment of UI design and corporate revenue generation. They have a massive financial incentive to design screens that maximize gratuities because their valuation is tied to processing volume.
But the operators, the C-suite leaders, the independent cafe owners, they're the ones choosing to lease these systems.
True.
They have access to the back-end dashboards. They could easily go in and turn the tip prompts off or set the defaults back to 10%. Why don't they? If they know they are paying swipe fees on the tips and they know the customers hate the screens, why are they keeping them on?
Because the operators are trapped by their own extreme economic realities. To understand why they tolerate the screens, we have to look at the concept of wage offloading.
Wage offload.
Yeah. If you examine the latest data from the National Restaurant Association, the typical pre-tax margin for a small to mid-sized restaurant or cafe is incredibly thin. Historically, this industry runs on a 3% to 5% margin.
Razor thin.
Right. Broadly speaking, food costs consume about 33 cents of every dollar, and labor consumes another 33. But in the post-pandemic era, those models have completely broken down.
Because of inflation.
Businesses have been pummeled by historic high commodity costs, supply chain disruptions, and soaring baseline wages.
The cost to just keep the lights on, buy basic ingredients, and maintain equipment has skyrocketed.
It has. So business owners were faced with an existential dilemma. They needed to pay their frontline staff significantly more just to retain them in a highly competitive post-COVID labor market. But if they raised the headline menu prices to accurately reflect that true cost of labor, if they started charging $8 or $9 for a standard drip coffee, or $20 for a basic sandwich, they feared severe customer attrition. Consumers would experience immediate sticker shock and stop coming.
So the digital tip screens became a pressure release valve for the business model.
Exactly. The screens offered a seductive alternative to raising prices. By allowing the UI to aggressively prompt customer tips to pad the employee's take-home pay, the business can advertise a highly competitive hourly rate, say $18 or $22 an hour, without actually funding that full amount out of corporate coffers.
Right.
The base wage paid by the employer might be much lower, but the digital tips bridge the gap.
So what does this all mean for the fundamental relationship between a business and its customer? The operators are essentially asking the consumer to voluntarily calculate and pay a portion of their internal payroll directly at the checkout screen.
It's a shadow tax.
It really is. They keep the menu price artificially low to get you in the door, and then hide the true sustainable cost of labor behind a high-pressure UI at the very end of the interaction.
Yeah.
But let's look at the human element here. I want to push back on the idea that this is just a neat accounting trick. What does this do to the frontline worker? Because it seems like the person standing behind the counter is absorbing all the hostility that the software generates.
They absolutely are. It creates an intensely toxic dynamic that labor analysts call a hostile dependency loop.
A hostile dependency loop.
Right. The workers are entirely dependent on these digital tips to achieve a living wage because the business model relies on wage offloading. But the consumers, who are dealing with their own inflation pressures, increasingly resent having to negotiate a gratuity for a service they haven't received yet.
Or for a transaction that required zero hospitality.
Exactly. It pits the customer directly against the lowest paid employee in the building.
Yes, and it strips the transaction of any genuine social rapport. Tipping used to be a retroactive expression of gratitude for a social interaction.
Now, the screen isolates the consumer from the worker socially while binding them together economically in a very tense way. You see the extreme endpoint of this logic in the gig economy delivery apps.
Oh, absolutely. On platforms like Uber Eats or DoorDash, the word tip has lost all meaning.
Completely.
You aren't tipping for exceptional service. You are entering a pre-service open market bid just to get a driver to accept the algorithm's dispatch and pick up your food before it gets cold. If you don't pre-tip 20%, your food sits on a counter for an hour. It's extortion disguised as gratuity.
And this is exactly why the systemic architecture is beginning to fracture. Consumers have realized the game is rigged, and they are pushing back.
Yeah.
We are currently navigating what researchers are defining as the Great Tip Screen Revolt.
The Great Tip Screen Revolt. And the data on this revolt is staggering. We are looking at a massive 2025 survey from Talker Research.
Oh yeah, this data is telling.
They surveyed 2,000 consumers to quantify exactly how much this psychological pressure is costing the public. They found that the average American spent $283 annually on what they explicitly categorized as guilt tipping.
Guilt tipping, meaning money they tipped purely out of pressure at a digital screen, not because they felt the service warranted it.
Exactly. $283 a year per person, simply to avoid the social discomfort of tapping no.
That is a massive sum of money extracted purely through behavioral friction.
It is. But here is the massive turning point in the data. That $283, it is actually a dramatic 38% drop from the $453 recorded just a year prior in 2024.
Wow.
The fever is breaking. Americans are actively guilt-tipping less frequently.
Sure.
Last year, the survey showed 6.3 instances of guilt-tipping per month. Now it's down to 4.2. We have hit the wall.
The fatigue is palpable in the data. 65% of Americans now state they are flat out fed up with tipping culture.
65%.
And over 78% believe companies should simply pay employees a comprehensive wage instead of relying on volatile customer tips.
We are seeing average quick service tips retreat significantly. They hit a pandemic peak of around 16.5% on average, and they have now slid down to under 14.5% and continue to drop.
The public's patience has simply evaporated.
But I want to dig into what this actually means for the businesses utilizing these screens. Because if I'm an operator, I might look at that and say, well, 14.5% is still higher than zero, so the screens are still working.
Right, but that's a dangerous assumption.
Because the sources point to a massive hidden cost.
Right, a profound hidden cost. That data signals a macro shift in consumer psychology. The efficacy of these UI dark patterns is rapidly waning because consumers are becoming desensitized to the screen of shame.
They're building an immunity.
Exactly. They are building up a psychological immunity to the swivel. And this has severe, quantifiable implications for hospitality brands. There is a deeply fascinating study published in Science Direct by consumer behavior researchers Sarah Hansen and Nathan B. Warren.
Okay, break this down.
It measures exactly how much this UI strategy destroys a business's most valuable metric, customer loyalty.
This study is the smoking gun of the entire deep dive. Let's really get into this methodology because for any executive listening, this is the data that should change how you run your operations tomorrow.
Hansen and Warren wanted to isolate the variable of observation during the tipping process. They analyzed an astounding 36,888 individual transactions at a high-volume brew pub over an 18-month period.
Wow, that's a massive sample size.
It really is. To test the behavioral response, they deployed 2 different point-of-sale configurations across the venue.
What were the 2 setups?
First, they had a traditional countertop system. The tablet was fixed to the bar. When it was time to pay, the screen prompted the customer, but the bartender typically stepped away or turned their back to make a drink.
Okay, the low-pressure environment, high privacy.
Right. They were unobserved while making their financial choice. The second setup utilized handheld systems.
Yeah.
The server brought a mobile POS terminal directly to the table or stood immediately across from the patron at the bar, holding the device while the customer navigated the tip screen.
This is the high observation environment. The classic stare down.
Exactly.
So what happened? Because over 36,000 transactions, the variance has to be incredibly clear.
The results were wildly revealing about human nature and consumer economics. When we look at the immediate financial yield, the handheld systems, the high observation environments, succeeded in extracting more money. They yielded higher tips in the moment, averaging 17.1%.
So the pressure works. The guilt extraction functions as designed.
It works in a vacuum. However, the researchers didn't just track the immediate tip. They tracked the unique credit cards to measure return visits over the 18 months.
Oh, this is the kicker.
And this is where the strategy collapses. The customers who were subjected to the high observation handheld systems showed significantly lower loyalty, averaging only 1.10 return visits over the entire study period.
Wow. So they squeezed an extra $1 out of them on a Tuesday, and the customer never came back.
Precisely. Now contrast that with the countertop systems that afforded high privacy. They yielded slightly lower immediate tips, averaging 15.8%.
Okay.
But they resulted in dramatically higher return visits, averaging 1.46 visits per customer.
That is a staggering difference in repeat business for a hospitality venue. It completely invalidates the short-term revenue model of the aggressive tip screen.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it exposes the fatal systemic flaw in the tipflation strategy. Businesses are eagerly trading their long-term customer lifetime value, their CLV, for a fractional short-term bump in tip percentage that doesn't even go to their bottom line.
It goes to the employee and the payment processor.
Exactly. The explicit observed request for a tip triggers what behavioral psychologists call psychological reactance.
Psychological reactance. Let's unpack that term. What exactly is happening in the consumer's brain in that moment?
Well, reactance occurs when a person feels that someone or something is threatening their behavioral freedom or autonomy. When a customer is confronted with a screen demanding a choice, while being actively observed by the person who benefits from that choice, they feel trapped in a double bind.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. If they tap no tip or select a low custom amount, they violate a social norm and feel like a villain. But if they tap the 20% default, they feel manipulated and coerced into subsidizing a business model they never agreed to. Either way, the transaction concludes with negative emotional valence.
They walk out of the store feeling vaguely irritated. It's transactional resentment. You might have successfully pressured me into an extra $1.50 today, but I now subconsciously associate your brand with anxiety, and you just lost my $50 a week morning coffee habit.
It is a catastrophic long-term strategy.
But this raises a really important question. If it's this toxic, and if we all hate it this much, why were we so easily manipulated for the last 5 years? Why did it take us half a decade to finally hit the breaking point and start pushing back?
To understand that delayed reaction, we have to look outside the restaurant industry and look at how the pandemic fundamentally, structurally rewired our relationship with money, debt, and digital abstraction.
Okay, this is where the Federal Reserve data comes in. How does macroeconomic debt policy explain why I tipped 25% for a bagel in 2022?
It's a crucial piece of the puzzle. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston conducted an extensive study utilizing the survey of consumer payment choice to map exactly how our payment behaviors shifted during the height of the crisis.
Okay.
Unsurprisingly, they found a massive, unprecedented acceleration toward remote and card-not-present transactions.
Right, nobody was handing over cash.
Yeah.
In 2021, something like 67% of the average restaurant's revenue was suddenly coming from food orders placed entirely online or over a mobile device.
Exactly. We rapidly shifted away from physical currency. And when you remove physical cash from a transaction, you introduce digital abstraction.
Right.
Swiping a plastic card or double-clicking the side button on your smartphone to activate Apple Pay does not trigger the same pain receptors in the brain as physically counting out $20 bills and handing them to another human being.
The friction of spending money was completely erased. Tapping a phone feels like sending an email. It doesn't feel like you were depleting your resources.
Precisely. And this digital abstraction collided with a very bizarre macroeconomic phenomenon. The Federal Reserve data highlighted a fascinating paradox regarding consumer spending and debt repayment during COVID-19.
Okay.
Through analyzing millions of account-level credit card records, economists tracked behavior across all consumer risk profiles. Early in the pandemic, local case incidents, meaning the actual severity of the virus in a specific zip code, had a massive negative effect on credit card spending.
People were terrified of getting sick, so regardless of government lockdowns, they voluntarily stayed home and stopped spending money on entertainment, dining, and travel.
Correct. But the paradox emerges when you look at what they did with their credit card debt.
All right.
Standard economic theory predicts that when consumers face a massive income shock or economic uncertainty, they will use credit to smooth out their consumption, meaning they will borrow money to ensure they can still buy groceries and maintain their baseline standard of living.
But that's not what happened, is it?
Not at all. The Fed study found that local pandemic severity also had a strong negative effect on credit card repayments. The drop in spending and the drop in debt repayment offset each other almost perfectly.
Interesting.
The result was that there was almost zero effect on overall credit card borrowing. Consumers fundamentally rejected the permanent income hypothesis. They didn't use credit to smooth their consumption. They aggressively adjusted their consumption downward in order to smooth their debt.
Now, let me translate this heavy macroeconomic data for you listening, because this is the key to the whole tipping phenomenon. We entered an era of profound, unprecedented economic anxiety.
Right.
We stopped going out. We held on to whatever cash we had. We focused intensely on managing our immediate debt. And simultaneously, we shifted our entire daily existence into a digital, touchless, abstracted economy.
Yes. The convergence of those factors created a unique vulnerability.
Exactly. Swiping a card became completely disconnected from the physical reality of wealth. So we became incredibly susceptible to gamified checkouts and behavioral dark patterns, exactly when our financial anxiety was at its absolute peak.
We were psychologically vulnerable.
And the POS software exploited that vulnerability by seamlessly packaging a hidden menu price increase as a moral, civic obligation to help essential workers survive.
And because of the digital abstraction, a $2 tip didn't feel like real money. It was just a tap on a screen. But that moral obligation was locked in by the software UI at default long after the actual health emergency had subsided and long after consumers had returned to normal spending patterns.
The machine never learned that the pandemic ended.
Exactly. The pandemic fatigue that the Federal Reserve researchers noted in late 2020 eventually morphed slowly into the tipping fatigue we see dominating the Talker research data in 2024 and 2025.
The abstraction wore off.
The inflation hit, and consumers finally looked at their bank statements and realized how much the friction was costing them.
It is an incredible, almost unbelievable convergence of public health crises, behavioral psychology, and fintech profit models.
Yeah.
The ecosystem was perfectly primed for this extortion.
It really was.
We're going to dive into exactly how state regulators are finally starting to crack down on these UI dark patterns, and more importantly, what the smartest C-suite leaders are doing right now to fix their operations and win back customer loyalty, right after this quick word from our sponsors. This podcast is supported by the generous commitment of our sponsors, and we extend a special thank you to HRB Universal. Their dedication to providing comprehensive resources and promoting excellence is key to empowering professionals across the culinary and hospitality industries. We also want to acknowledge the Plate and Pour Collective Equity Partner Program. This initiative exemplifies a true commitment to fostering shared success and equitable growth within the food and beverage sector. helping entrepreneurs build a more inclusive and thriving future. The journey to the C-suite is fueled by innovation, relentless dedication, and the right network. We encourage you to engage with the resources and support offered by our sponsors. For details on how to connect with HRB Universal and the Plate & Pour Collective Equity Partner Program, visit hrbuni.ni.com or just Google HRB Universal. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've just spent the first half of the show breaking down the exact anatomy of the digital guilt trip. We looked at how fintech platforms gamified our empathy to artificially inflate their gross processing volumes, and how that high observation pressure is actively destroying long-term customer lifetime value.
Yeah, it's a bleak picture.
But the tides are rapidly shifting. The great tip screen revolt isn't just consumers angrily tapping the no-tip button on their morning coffee. Regulators, lawmakers, and politicians are actively noticing this massive wave of consumer fatigue.
They absolutely are. And it is vital to note here, from a position of strict policy neutrality, as we are simply reporting on the structural changes being proposed in the sources and not endorsing any specific political viewpoint, that we are seeing legislative pushback originating from across the entire political spectrum.
Right.
The sheer volume and bipartisan nature of the proposed legislation indicates just how systemic and universal this frustration has become for the American consumer.
It's one of the few things everyone agrees on. Nobody likes the iPad swivel.
Exactly.
Let's talk about the specific bills and mandates, because they are targeting entirely different parts of the problem. Some are targeting the labor side, some are targeting the software itself.
Let's start with the labor side. One major piece of legislation heavily discussed in our research is the proposed One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Okay, what does that do?
This framework, slated to take effect between 2025 and 2028, addresses the taxation of gratuities. It proposes allowing eligible workers in over 60 specific service categories, bartenders, cooks, waitstaff, salon workers, to deduct up to $25,000 in tips from their taxable income.
Okay, I have to push back on this, because while that sounds like a massive win for the individual worker's take-home pay, doesn't it completely contradict the entire consumer movement we just discussed?
How so?
Well, if 78% of consumers want businesses to pay a flat living wage and abolish tipping, but the government suddenly makes tips tax-free up to $25,000, workers will fight tooth and nail to keep the digital guilt trip alive. They would much rather receive tax-free tips than a fully taxed higher base wage.
That is the profound contradiction in the policy, and it is a brilliant observation. It effectively entrenches the tipping model from the labor supply side. If passed, the incentive structure for employees would heavily favor aggressive tip solicitation, placing them in direct opposition to the consumer fatigue we see in the Talker research. It solves a short-term tax burden for the worker, but exacerbates the hostile dependency loop.
So the labor legislation might actually make the friction worse. What about the consumer protection side? Are regulators going after the tech platforms?
Yes, and this is where we see aggressive moves against the digital architecture itself. For example, California passed SB 478, which is broadly known as a junk fee ban.
Oh, I've heard of this one.
Yeah, while its primary target was deceptive pricing in ticketing and lodging, its application to hospitality requires businesses to display the true, fully realized cost of a product up front. You can no longer lure a customer in with a low menu price and then tack on a mandatory health wellness fee or a kitchen operations charge at the end of the transaction.
That's a great start, but it doesn't ban optional tipping. Are there mandates targeting the actual UI, like the visual design of the dark patterns we talked about earlier?
This is the frontier of the regulatory pushback. Several state-level proposals and consumer protection agencies are demanding strict UI parity for point-of-sale tablets.
UI parity.
They are proposing mandates that require the software to display the no-tip button or the custom amount button in the exact same font size, the exact same color, and with the exact same visual weight as the 20 or 25% quick select buttons.
That is huge.
Yeah.
They are trying to legislate the psychology of the screen.
Exactly. The goal is to mathematically defeat the path of least resistance. The dark pattern relies on visual obscurity.
Right.
If opting out is visually and mechanically just as easy as opting in, if the 0 button is just as prominent as the 20 button, it removes the manipulative friction. The choice becomes truly neutral again.
So if you're a business leader listening to this right now, if you are a regional director for a cafe chain or an independent quick service operator, how do you get ahead of this? Because waiting for legislation is a losing strategy.
Yeah.
How do you stop hemorrhaging customer trust and loyalty while still keeping your margins intact and your staff paid? What are the actual actionable strategies the top quartile of operators are using to navigate out of this mess?
Well, the most definitive, albeit radical, strategy gaining traction is the zero prompt or all-inclusive model. This is a movement toward what is often called hospitality included pricing.
Hospitality included.
Right. Forward-thinking independent restaurants and specialty coffee shops are going into their POS dashboards and removing the tip prompt entirely. When the customer pays, there is no screen swivel, no question, no friction.
But again, the margins are still 3 to 5%. They still have to pay their staff a competitive living wage. How does the math actually work if you cut off that revenue stream?
The math requires a total recalibration of the menu. They raise the baseline item prices by 15 to 20% across the board.
Oh.
So a $5 flat white becomes a $6 flat white. A $12 sandwich becomes a $14 sandwich. The business absorbs the true cost of labor directly into the cost of goods sold. But the crucial, non-negotiable step for this to work is radical upfront transparency with the consumer.
They have to know they aren't being ripped off by the new price.
Right. Top operators print a highly visible, straightforward message directly on the menus, on the receipts, and on signage at the register. It says something like, "No tipping expected or accepted. Fair, living wages for our team are fully built into our prices."
It takes the math, the guilt, and the awkward social negotiation completely off the customer's plate.
Yeah.
You see the price, you evaluate the value, you pay the price, and the transaction is over.
It restores the dignity of the interaction.
But I have to bring up a counterpoint from our sources.
Oh.
Courtness Hotels, a highly respected restaurateur from the neighborhood group of companies in Gulf Canada, explicitly mentioned how terrifying it is to make that leap.
It is terrifying.
He noted that if his operations moved to a strict no-tipping, hospitality-included model, he would have to raise his menu prices by roughly 30% just to maintain current staff compensation. And he fears the public simply isn't ready for that kind of upfront sticker shock.
Right.
The entire North American dining ecosystem hasn't been built that way for a century.
Disatel's concern is entirely valid, and it represents the primary hurdle for the C-suite. First mover disadvantage is a real risk.
If you raise your prices 30% and the cafe across the street keeps their prices artificially low and relies on tip screens, uneducated consumers might just perceive you as overpriced and go to the competitor.
Exactly. However, the Science Direct study we unpacked earlier provides a compelling counterweight to that fear.
How so?
The data proves that the alternative, the high-pressure stare-down, is actively destroying repeat business anyway. You are losing customers through resentment.
So you have to choose your heart. Do you risk upfront sticker shock, or do you accept the silent attrition of customers who hate your checkout process?
Precisely. Now, if a full hospitality-included model is deemed too risky for a specific brand, the second actionable strategy is interface calibration.
Interface calibration.
This is a highly effective middle ground. It involves going into the back end of the POS and manually adjusting the default thresholds to modest, context-appropriate suggestions.
Meaning, stop asking for 25% for handing me a muffin.
Exactly. If you run a quick service bakery or a counter service taco stand, your default options absolutely should not start at 20%. They should be calibrated to the level of service provided.
Like 5 or 10%.
Perhaps 5%, 10%, or flat dollar amounts like 50 cents or $1. Consumer research strongly indicates that 79% of consumers view any percentage suggestion higher than 10% in a non-seated counter service setting as inherently inappropriate.
You have to match the ask to the effort.
Yes. And another fascinating tactical shift within interface calibration is the use of emotional design on the screen.
Emotional design.
Studies in UI design show that incorporating familiar emojis, like a simple, polite smiley face next to the prompts, can significantly soften the emotional response.
Really?
Yeah, it subtly signals that the request is genuinely optional, reducing the consumer's feeling of coercion and, ironically, often improving voluntary tip revenue because the psychological reactance is lowered.
Okay, so strategy 1 for the C-suite is to go fully all-inclusive and ban tips. Strategy 2 is to lower the percentages and adjust the UI so the asks aren't mathematically insulting. What is the third strategy for operators?
Strategy 3 is preserving privacy and control. As the Science Direct study proved, the biggest driver of consumer resentment is the social observation, the physical proximity of the barista watching your finger.
Right.
Businesses can completely mitigate this by giving customers the option to finalize or modify their tips after the physical transaction has concluded, away from the counter.
Like how you rate and tip an Uber driver after you've already left the car.
Exactly. This is the model heavily utilized by apps like Instacart, Uber Eats, and DoorDash. While those gig platforms certainly have their own systemic issues, the specific UI feature of allowing tip modification post-transaction restores the customer's perceived autonomy.
That makes total sense.
If a cafe allows a customer to pay via a QR code at their table or finalizes the receipt via an app where they can tip from their car, it removes the immediate public pressure. It neutralizes the psychological reactance that damages long-term loyalty.
Make the transaction private again.
Yeah.
If you must use a tablet, at least implement a system where the employee steps away. Okay, those are 3 brilliant, actionable strategies for operators and executives.
Definitely.
But what about the rest of us, the everyday consumers who have to stand in line at the bakery tomorrow morning? What are the rules of engagement for us? Because I know all this data now, but I still feel that intense pit in my stomach when the screen flips around and the line is watching me.
It is deeply ingrained, but etiquette experts and financial advisors are aggressively encouraging consumers to reclaim their agency.
How do we do that?
The key is to establish strict, unshakable personal boundaries before you ever step foot inside the establishment. You need a pre-planned rule so you do not fall victim to the in-the-moment anchoring bias and social pressure. They refer to this framework as the counter rule.
Walk me through the counter rule. How do I apply it tomorrow?
The counter rule draws a hard line between genuine hospitality and basic retail transactions. It dictates that you absolutely maintain standard, customary tipping, meaning 18 to 20% or more if deserved, for sit-down, full-service dining.
Right?
And for delivery drivers using their personal vehicles, and for personal care services like haircuts, where a worker is dedicating extended, personalized time to you.
Okay, that's the baseline we all agree on. Protect the workers who actually rely on the traditional tipping model.
Right. But the second half of the counter rule dictates that for quick service counter transaction screen prompts, you treat them as entirely 100% optional.
Completely optional.
Tapping no tip or leaving a flat 50 cents for a complex coffee order is a rejection of the software algorithm, not a personal insult to the worker. Experts agree it is perfectly acceptable modern etiquette to tip 0% for a basic takeaway order, a drip coffee, or a prepackaged muffin.
You have to mentally separate the human from the hardware. You have to remind yourself that the machine is a piece of SaaS technology designed to maximize corporate revenue, not a moral judge of your character.
Exactly.
You know, Marcus Vance, the software engineer we talked about earlier, who tipped onto self-serve coffee, the sources mentioned he actually went back to that exact same coffee shop a few days later to test his own anxiety.
And what happened when he confronted it?
He ordered a simple drip coffee. The screen flipped around. He said he looked the barista directly in the eye, smiled, said thank you so much, and deliberately hit the no-tip button.
Good for him.
And you know what happened? The sky didn't fall. The barista just smiled back, handed him his cup, and called the next person in line. Marcus realized that the overwhelming guilt only exists because the software is meticulously designed to manufacture it.
That's a huge breakthrough.
The barista didn't care. The machine cared.
That is a profound realization, and it's incredibly liberating for the consumer. It is also highly beneficial to look outside our own borders. Brief exposure to international norms can completely break the spell of the American digital guilt trip.
Oh, for sure.
When you realize how anomalous the U.S. system is, the pressure evaporates.
Right, because we treat this like it's a universal law of physics, but it's just a localized quirk of our economy.
Exactly. In most of Europe, service is legally required to be included in the menu price. A tip is truly a small bonus for exceptional care, usually rounding up the bill.
Right.
In Australia, robust minimum wage laws have largely eliminated the guilt tipping phenomenon entirely. And in Japan, leaving a tip can actually be considered profoundly offensive.
Wow, offensive.
Yeah, good service is simply viewed as the basic standard of doing business, and offering extra money implies the employer isn't taking care of their staff. The United States is uniquely caught in this trap, where tech companies have weaponized a cultural custom to subsidize corporate payrolls.
We are the only ones playing this bizarre, high-stakes psychological game every single time we buy a bagel. It's exhausting. But it's also incredibly empowering to realize that the power ultimately rests with the consumer. We can just opt out.
We really can.
If you hit no tip on a counter transaction, you aren't breaking a social contract. You are refusing to pay a hidden surcharge. You are refusing to generate free gross payment volume for a fintech company in Silicon Valley.
And this raises the most important question for the future of the industry. As consumers continue to opt out and as tipping fatigue drives those percentages down, the economic burden will inevitably shift back to where it belongs, the employers.
Back to the business.
Right. Businesses will eventually be forced to abandon wage offloading. They will have to raise their base wages, reflect the true, transparent cost of labor in their menu prices, and compete on the actual quality of their product. It will be painful in the short term, but it is the transparent, sustainable model the hospitality industry desperately needs to survive the next decade.
We are finally paying off COVID-19's credit card. The hazard pay era is officially over, the digital abstraction is fading, and the great tip screen revolt is simply the market aggressively correcting itself.
It's about time.
But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your week and navigate your own business decisions. We've spent this entire deep dive exposing how fintech platforms seamlessly gamify our empathy, our social anxiety, and our guilt just to incrementally increase their corporate processing fees at the local coffee shop. If our psychology is that easily manipulated by a simple tablet interface and a swivel stand, where else in our daily digital lives are we quietly paying an invisible social tax just to avoid a moment of engineered friction? We look forward to having you join us for our next episode of From Kitchen to C-Suite, where we will continue to explore captivating topics designed to elevate your career and entrepreneurial drive. Don't miss a beat. Whether you're commuting or chilling on the couch, we've got you covered. On the go, subscribe and listen via Riverside and from kitchentosuite.com or our website, hrbuni.com. You can also search for us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, Audible, iHeartRadio, or Deezer, or wherever you get your daily audio fix. Awful and take HRB Network wherever you go. Download the new mobile web app.
hrbuni.com/app. Take HRB Network wherever you go. Download the new mobile web app. Oh, and the big screen. Level up your experience by watching the From Kitchen to C-Suite podcast on the HRB Network on Roku or Fire TV. Take HRB Network wherever you go. Download the new mobile web app. Until our next broadcast, continue to innovate and strive for superior achievement.